This video is a criticism of the video, Moon Machines, the Lunar Module. It shows the many problems it contains. Von Braun was initially planning to send a unique big rocket to the moon, and make it land on it. But an engineer on Hubbard said it was not a good idea and had a better idea. Send instead two smaller spaceships attached together. The first one would take the second one to the moon. The second one would detach from the first one with two of the astronauts aboard and land on the moon. At the end of the mission, the second one would bring back the astronauts to the first one. Then the first one would jettison the second one and would bring back the three astronauts to the Earth. But he was not taken seriously because of the difficulty of the rendezvous between the two spaceships at the end of the mission, something which had never been made before and could not be tested on Earth. Hubbard's idea was ranked in the crowd of crazy ideas which would never be put into practice. But von Braun was completely opposed to this idea that many were finding insane. He was rejecting Hubbard's idea and sticking to his idea of sending a unique big rocket to the moon. Finally, very unexpectedly, von Braun accepted the idea of Hubbard, at the great wonderment of his own team. Being able to change one's mind has always been considered a proof of intelligence. The company Grumman won the contract for building the Lunar Module. Grumman studies the project of the Lunar Module, but nobody exactly knows what the lunar surface looks like. Yet we know what the lunar surface looks like. The French filmmaker Méliès has shown it to us in the movie, The Trip to the Moon, at the start of the 20th century. It is perfectly suited for a fantasy project. The first tests of a small model of the Lunar Module were not conclusive at all. The Lunar Module could not land without tipping over. This at least was showing one thing: the Lunar Module has to be perfectly stationary relatively to the lunar ground before landing and descend vertically. If the Lunar Module laterally moves relatively to the lunar ground when landing, it is almost sure to tip over. In order to gain weight, the seats are removed, and the astronauts will stand up in the Lunar Module. They will be secured with a restraint system. This figure shows the restraint system which is allowing the astronaut to remain on the platform in spite of the moves of the craft. The problem with this restraint system is that it is not centered. When the astronaut pulls on it because he loses his balance, instead of maintaining him on the center of the platform, this system pulls him on the left and thus contributes to make him lose his balance. In the tests of the round hatch, the astronaut was not managing to get into the Lunar Module, for he was slipping. It seems that Grumman hadn't had the idea of using an anti-slip coating, so Grumman decided to use a square hatch instead. Using a half-round hatch seems to be beyond the capacity of imagination of Grumman. The helium is turned around in all directions to see if nothing falls down when shaken. When we see what the helium looks like on the photos of the missions, it doesn't seem a useless test. This is a schema of the NASA video showing the descent of the Lunar Module on the Moon. They say that the main engine is used in the descent, and the RCS when close to the lunar surface. In their schema, the RCS is fired only once in the descent. In reality, the Lunar Module was regularly turning in the descent, as the horizontal speed was decreasing, and the engine of the Lunar Module had to counter more the lunar retraction. That means that the RCS was not used just once in the powered descent, but all along it. In their schema, when the lunar module is close to the lunar surface, the RCS turns the lunar module in bias and the lunar module is pushed by its main engine the way that a helicopter does, do they say. The astronauts also often talk about piloting the lunar module like a helicopter, by pitching it. In reality, the flight of the lunar module over the lunar surface is absolutely nothing to do with the flight of a helicopter. When a helicopter moves forward, it bends its main blades, which generates two F-forces. The vertical one allows to sustain the helicopter in the air, and the second one allows the horizontal move of the helicopter. The speed that the helicopter is moving forward depends on the slant of the blades. But in the void of the moon, there is nowhere to provide a force which would counter a lateral move of the lunar module. If the lunar module was pitching and was being pushed by its main engine, as there is no force to counter the horizontal move of the lunar module would constantly accelerate, and would very rapidly reach a speed which would be incompatible with looking for a spot to land on. That means that the lunar module can absolutely not behave this way to move over the lunar surface. In fact, when the lunar module is flying over the lunar surface, it must be vertical so that the main engine counters the lunar attraction, and it must move by using its lateral thrusters. Even if the lateral thrusters are less powerful than the main engine, as there is no force to counter the lateral move of the lunar module, they are also able to reach any speed. The only difference with the main engine is that they will take more time to reach a given speed, but they will also manage to reach it whatever this given speed is. In fact, to move in one direction, the corresponding thrusters must be fired, but not permanently. If the lateral thrusters were permanently fired, they would indefinitely accelerate the lunar module, which could reach a very important speed also incompatible with looking for a spot to land on. The lateral thrusters must only be fired the necessary time to reach the desired speed. Once that the desired speed is attained, they must be shut off, otherwise they would continue to accelerate the lunar module. In order to stop the lunar module, the opposite thrusters must be fired, and only the necessary time to stop the lunar module. As the lateral thrusters could not be throttled, and the accuracy of their commands was rather rough, it probably was not easy for the lunar module to attain a total immobility. So the way that they show the lunar module moving over the lunar surface is an obvious joke. For the NASA engineers could not ignore that the lunar module could not behave this way when flying over the lunar surface. Then a NASA video shows a schema of the ascent of the lunar module and its rendezvous with the command module. But in fact, the lunar module does not dock to the command module like their schema shows, but this way instead. In their schema, the lunar module does not dock on its docking hatch, but on its side instead. It is turned of a quarter of a turn, clockwise, of what it should be. Once again, it's an obvious joke of the NASA engineers. Now you can notice that there was this gracious bulk on the right side of the lunar module. This bulk contains the fuel tank. The official reason for the fuel tank to be so much accented is that, since the oxidizer has a density which is 1.5 times greater than the one of the fuel tank needed to be placed 1.5 times farther than the oxidizer tank from the ascent engine, so that the center of gravity of the lunar module would be over the ascent engine when the tanks are full, and there would be no misalignment torque. The problem with this conception is that, when the tanks were emptying, the center of gravity was progressively moving right, because of the asymmetry of the ascent module, which was making a misalignment torque appear. If the ascent engine had been gimballed, it could have been swiveled so that the thrust could be directed again in direction of the center of gravity. But the ascent engine was not gimballed, it was fixed, and so this solution was excluded. So, the only solution to counter the misalignment torque was to use the lateral thrusters to create a counter torque opposing to the misalignment torque. The problem is that the lateral thrusters could not be throttled, their thrust could not be adjusted so that the counter torque they create would exactly be equivalent to the misalignment torque. The consequence is that they could not be permanently fired but only periodically, and, as they could not be activated at sufficient frequency, the result is that it was not possible to avoid a consistent swing move. This animation explains what was happening. The misalignment torque was making the LM turn clockwise and go right. Then the lateral thrusters were fired, and were making the LM turn counterclockwise and go left. Then the lateral thrusters were shut off, otherwise they would go on making the LM turn counterclockwise and go left, and the misalignment torque was making the LM turn clockwise and go right again, and so on. The more the misalignment torque was strong, and the more the amplitude of the oscillating move was consistent, for the frequency of command of the lateral thrusters could not be increased to counter the misalignment torque faster. Now, this swing move is not a supposition, it is confirmed by Clavius himself, who says this on his site. As the off-axis thrust caused the ascent stage to rotate, the RCS jets fired to counter the rotation and return it to the correct attitude. This is why the films of the LM ascent seem to show a periodic sway or oscillation. The RCS fought the off-axis ascent engine. Yet, the Lunar Module also needs the RCS to control the attitude of the Lunar Module in the powered ascent, having both to counter the misalignment torque and to control the attitude of the Lunar Module is an important complication of the guidance. And if the RCS was running out of propellant before the end of the powered ascent, it would be fatal to the Lunar Module. Moreover, the Lunar Module needs to have propellant left to make the docking maneuver when it has reached the orbit of the command module. Yet, even with a fixed engine, there was a way to avoid the misalignment torque, by using a pair of smaller tanks instead of a unique tank for both the oxidizer and the fuel. Each tank of the pair of oxidizer tanks would be placed at equal distance to the ascent engine on each side of it, and the same for the fuel tanks. It might have added a little weight to the ascent module, but, just to save a little propellant for the main engine, a whole lot of propellant of the RCS was wasted to counter the misalignment torque, with the possibility that the RCS could run out of propellant. The engines of the Lunar Module could not work like those which work in Earth's atmosphere. In Earth's atmosphere they can use the oxygen of atmosphere. In the void there is no oxygen, so an engine which is conceived to work in Earth's atmosphere could not work in the void. To make an engine work in the void, it must use a special mixture of fuel and oxidizer. The problem is that this mixture is highly toxic and explosive. It means that the astronauts were traveling in flying bombs. Each time an engine of the Lunar Module was tested, it had to be rebuilt. It means that the Lunar Module was sent to the Moon with an engine which had not been tested on Earth. So they were sending a Lunar Module land on the Moon with an untested engine. There was no guarantee it would not have a problem. They truly were playing the game of the Russian roulette. They want to protect the lunar module from the violent solar heat with a Miller blanket looking like gold. They seriously think that it will be an efficient protection. We can have doubts about it when we see how someone can easily set to fire a Miller blanket. Some astronauts, among whom Neil Armstrong and Pete Conrad, trained on the lunar training vehicle. But this training vehicle proved to be very unstable and dangerous. The least problem was unrecoverable and fatal. Once Armstrong had to eject himself and land with parachute to save his life, while his training vehicle was crashing on the ground and exploding. Yet the problem it had only was a momentary one. If the same problem had happened to a plane, it would have had no consequence for the plane. The plane could have flown till the problem had disappeared. This shows the difference between the lunar module and a helicopter. While the lunar module is sure to crash in case of problem with its main engine, a helicopter is able to safely land with its motor off, just by using the auto-rotation of its blades, like this demonstration shows. Due to the inherent instability and dangerosity of the training vehicle, the astronauts were then trained in a simulation cabin instead of the training vehicle. But the way that this simulation cabin was working has nothing to do with piloting a real lunar module over the moon. It's like saying that someone is able to make a Boeing fly because he has played with Flight Simulator. The Boeing pilots are also training on simulators, but these simulators are much more advanced than the one which was used in Apollo, and a company would never let a pilot fly a plane with passengers if he has only trained on the simulator. Armstrong himself insisted that training in the simulation cabin was completely insufficient, and that the training also had to be done on the training vehicle. Yet the co-pilots Buzz Aldrin and Albin only trained in the simulation cabin, and never on the training vehicle. Little before the start of the missions, the lunar module still had plenty of problems, but NASA did not want to wait for all the problems to be solved, for the schedule set by JFK absolutely had to be respected. Too bad that JFK didn't say that men would land on the moon within 3 decades instead of a single decade. But JFK was no more here to update his speech. In a test in a void chamber, a window of the lunar module exploded. Imagine if that had happened in the void of space. Finally, after the missions of Apollo 9 and Apollo 10, which proved that the lunar module was safe, the rocket containing the astronauts of Apollo 11 lifts off. They are expected to land for the first time on the moon. The lunar module separates from the command module to start its trip to the lunar surface. This animation is made with a sequence of photos of Apollo 14. On it we can see the lunar module moving away from the command module, and also turning over in all directions in the same time. But why would the lunar module do that? Some Apollo believers have said that it was to allow the pilot of the command module to inspect the lunar module before its trip to the lunar surface. But if the lunar module really had turned over just to allow the pilot of the command module to inspect it, it would have stayed close to the command module while it was turning over. It would not have moved away in the same time. And now the NASA video shows us the command module under the lunar module, which is shooting this video. But why would the command module be under the lunar module? It's the Lunar Module which is landing on the Moon, not the command module. Some Apollo believers asserted that it was necessitated by the separation maneuver. But on the photo AS 1137-5447, the command module is much farther under the Lunar Module. It's doubtful that the separation maneuver was necessitating this. Armstrong would have had a great difficulty to find a safe spot to land on. He would have had less than a half minute of fuel left when he landed. But when we look at the lunar surface, it is obvious that he could have landed much before, for we see no real difficulty, only a little hole here and there, nothing to really prevent him from safely landing. So we must deduce that, if Armstrong waited to be almost short of fuel before landing, it was to keep the suspense alive. As previously said, the Lunar Module was needing to constantly control its attitude during the powered descent. The problem is that the lateral thrusters of the RCS could not be throttled, and they could only be controlled with a rough accuracy. It means that instead of the descent being smooth like this, it was rather looking like this. When the guidance was commanding the thrusters to turn the Lunar Module clockwise, the Lunar Module was turning a little more than desired. At the next step, the guidance would make a correction, but this correction would overcorrect the attitude. At the next step, the guidance would correct the previous correction, which again would be overcorrected, and so on. On the NASA video, we can see that the Lunar Module is not still relatively to the lunar surface, but laterally moving instead. How can we see that? Observe the holes we can see on the lunar surface. You can see that they are moving, which indicates a lateral move of the Lunar Module. Yet we have seen, and the tests made on the model of the Lunar Module prove it, that, when landing, the Lunar Module must be absolutely still relatively to the lunar surface, for, if the Lunar Module lands laterally, it is almost sure to tip over when touching the ground. But all is well that ends well, like usual in the Apollo missions, and we can see the astronauts gambling on the Moon. We can see it on TV, so it must be true. And nobody wonders that the astronauts appear to be transparent. So they even were able to use special effects on the Moon. And once again the great suspense. Will the Lunar Module be able to lift off from the lunar surface without any problem? This video taken in Apollo 14 is total bullshit. It is impossible that the flag could be shaken this way in the void of the Moon when the Lunar Module lifts off. Once again, nobody wonders about this sequence. And here the command module can see the Lunar Module flying under it as it is returning to the command module. On this excerpt, the Lunar Module remains under the vertical of the command module and flies at the same speed. But it is not at all the way that the Lunar Module comes back to the orbit of the command module. The Lunar Module flies faster than the command module, arrives on its back, overpasses it, and arrives ahead of the command module on its orbit. The NASA video then shows us the Lunar Module lifting off in Apollo 17. Very surprisingly, we can't see the plume of the ascent engine. But Michael Shermer has an explanation already for the invisibility of this plume. In his debunk, he says, the propellants, like liquid hydrogen/liquid oxygen space shuttle main engines and Saturn V second and third stages, or hydrazine UDMH/nitrogen tetroxide. Gemini's Titan IO booster produce a near-invisible flame. But Michael Sharma should explain us why the plume of the thrusters is visible in the separation of the SIDB from the SIB, while this separation also happened in the void of space, and the thrusters were also using a propellant. So what, Mr. Sharma? Would the plume have a variable visibility, or would your explanation be bullshit? Like previously said, the more the propellant tanks are empty, and the more the center of gravity of the module moves right, and so the stronger the misalignment torque becomes. Consequently, as the lateral thrusters cannot correct the misalignment torque faster, the amplitude of the swaying move of the lunar module is going to gradually increase. At the end of the video of the liftoff of the lunar module of Apollo 17, we can see this swaying move of the lunar module, and we can see that the amplitude of the sinusoidal move of the lunar module is steadily increasing. Some Apollo believers have claimed that this sinusoidal move was not coming from the lunar module itself, but from the operator controlling the camera with a hand controller as he was trying to center the lunar module on the image. But it is not possible for the following reasons. 1. If the operator was really trying to center the lunar module on the screen, the axis of the sine curve that the lunar module is following would be on the middle of the screen, and not near the bottom of it like what we can see. 2. The operator knows that there is delay between the maneuver he makes on the hand controller and the results he sees on the screen, so he is not going to continually move the hand controller, but make a maneuver on it, and wait for the result of his maneuver before making the next maneuver. 3. If the operator is not clumsy, the amplitude of the move is going to decrease. So the move of the lunar module we see on the screen would rather look like something like this. Now, if the amplitude of the swaying move of the lunar module is already that important while the lunar module is still only at the beginning of the power descent, we can imagine what it will be some minutes later. It is very likely that the misalignment torque is going to increase at such point that it will become greater than the counter torque that the lateral thrusters are able to apply, and from that moment, the lateral thrusters will no more be able to compensate the misalignment torque. It will be fatal to the lunar module, which will inevitably crash on the lunar ground. There is even better. This is the schema of the command logical interface of the thrusters of the RCS, which is shown in the official handbook of the Lunar Module. This schema contains electronic problems, but, as most people don't have competencies in electronics, we will not talk about them. In order to apply the counter torque opposing to the misalignment torque, the thrusters which have to be used have been circled on the schema of the RCS. Each command of this interface was activating a pair of thrusters. The command of positive roll was firing two vertical thrusters opposed to each other, B3D and A3U. The command of negative roll was also firing two vertical thrusters opposed to each other, A2D and B2U. The command of positive pitch was again firing two vertical thrusters opposed to each other, A2D and B2U. And, unsurprisingly, the command of negative pitch was again firing two vertical thrusters opposed to each other, A1U and B1D. So how do you think that the RCS could be controlled with each command firing two thrusters directly opposed to each other? Even if you have not been very attentive to the physics lessons, you at least know that two equal forces directly opposed to each other cancel their mutual effects. It means that, with the interface which is shown in the handbook of the Lunar Module, the RCS was just simply unable to control the attitude of the LM and also to apply the counter torque allowing to compensate the misalignment torque of the ascent module. The engineers have even added a little more fantasy to this interface. Indeed, instead of directly applying the commands to the interface, they were modulating a high-frequency carrier with each command, sending the modulated signal through a wire, and demodulating the carrier at the other end of the wire to apply the command to the interface. But you only need to do that when you want to send commands to a drone, for the commands can't travel through air. They need a high-frequency carrier to travel, like the radio waves which allow to carry the voice. But when you want to send a command through a wire, you don't need to do that. The command can directly travel through the wire. This useless complication is again a joke from the NASA engineers and another hint of the fakery. So if the RCS was unable to normally control the lateral thrusters, it means that the solution of compensating the misalignment torque with the RCS could not work. It means that shortly after the liftoff, the misalignment torque would make the Lunar Module turn like a girouette. And the ascent module would consequently crash on the lunar ground. Anyway, if the RCS could not control the attitude of the Lunar Module, it means that the powered descent was impossible too, for the Lunar Module also needs to control its attitude in the powered descent. But on the other hand, there is no problem to make the Lunar Module land on Area 51 with a crane. It is a very simple mechanical maneuver, which can be tested on Earth. On this excerpt of the NASA video, the Lunar Module is very visibly not on the orbit of the command module while it should be on it when it is close to the command module. And now comes the problem which occurred in Apollo 13 with the famous Houston. We've had a problem. An explosion would have happened in an oxygen tank of the service module. A true nightmare, the possibility that the astronauts would die in space. When we see this photo of the service module which has been taken after it has been jettisoned after the return to the Earth, we can see that this explosion was quite important. It is absolutely obvious that this explosion had consequences on both the trajectory and the attitude of the spaceship. The trajectory was deviated, and the spaceship started spinning. As in the void and like in the atmosphere, there is no resistance force to slow down the spin of the spaceship. It will spin as long as the spin is not countered by the lateral thrusters. It is obvious that in these circumstances, the AGC would have more needed than ever to correct the trajectory and the attitude of the spaceship. Especially since it was the AGC which was updating the attitude angles and the velocities by counting the pulses sent by the IMU. If the AGC does not count these pulses as they occur, they are immediately lost. Yet after the incident, the AGC was shut off for 80 hours. So when the AGC was powered again, it was not known where the spaceship was, and neither how it was oriented. Given the problems of the command module, the astronauts had to retreat in the Lunar Module. The lunar module was designed for 2 astronauts standing up, and yet the 3 astronauts of Apollo 13 seemed to be comfortably installed in the lunar module. But as the service module had become unable to push the combined spaceship, the problem was how to save the mission and allow the astronauts to safely come back to Earth. Then the engineers had the luminous idea. It would be the engine of the lunar module which would push the combined spaceship. The mission was saved. In the video taken from the spaceship, we can see the lunar ground alternately growing and shrinking. It means that the lunar module was playing the insane game of the Russian mountains, alternately coming closer to the moon and going away from it. But in order to play this game, the lunar module would have needed to use its engine, thus wasting its propellant, while, by following a natural orbit of the moon, it could have saved its propellant. Sure, the spaceship was in a very precarious situation, implying it should have to save as much as possible its propellant, and yet it was taking the fantasy of uselessly wasting it, just for the fun. Anyway, even if the spaceship has flown normally by following the regular orbit, there still was a problem. Indeed, in the other missions, the spaceship which had come back to Earth was consisting of the service module and the command module without the lunar module. In Apollo 13, the whole combined spaceship coming back to Earth was not only consisting of the service module and the command module, but also of the lunar module. Sure, the service module had lost weight in the explosion because of the oxygen burnt in the explosion, but not as much as the weight of the lunar module. And the lunar module had 3 times less propellant than the service module. It means that the lunar module had to bring back to Earth a combined spaceship which was heavier and with less propellant than the service module had to do in the other Apollo missions. But miracles constantly happen in the Apollo missions. But the maneuver perfectly worked, and the combined spaceship reappeared on the other side of the moon. In the video taken in the spaceship of Apollo 13 there are many surprises, but there is one which outclasses all the other ones, and that we can see on this animation made with an excerpt of the video. In this sequence, the camera is exploring the spaceship. The way that the camera is moving, it is obvious that one of the 3 astronauts is holding it. The sequence has been sped up, not to be too long. Then the camera is moving down, with an astronaut holding it, and we can see 2 of the astronauts. We can't see the 3rd astronaut, for he is obviously the one who is holding the camera, but the camera backs up and suddenly we can see a 3rd man. He is in the shadow, but it is undoubtedly a man, and it can only be the 3rd astronaut. But if it is not the 3rd astronaut who is holding the camera, then who is it? Probably a stowaway. The lunar module was conceived to allow 2 men to live for a duration of 50 hours. But now it was 3 men who had to survive in the lunar module for the double of that duration. So how to allow them to survive in these conditions? The answer was by using the resources of the command module. But the problem is that the Lunar Module had round cartridges while the Command Module had square cartridges instead. So the problem was how to make square cartridges fit in a round canister. Oh sure, they could not use the same standard for the cartridges of the two spaceships because of the necessary suspense in the mission. Finally they found the solution by using plastic tubes and duct tape to make the cartridges communicate with each other. MacGyver was aboard. When the command module penetrates into the atmosphere, the ground loses the communication with it. So the ground was able to keep the communication when the spaceship was very far, near the moon, but it can't keep it when it is near the Earth. The Apollo astronauts think to have made a direct re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. The problem of making a direct re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere is that the command module has a very high velocity when approaching the Earth. If it does not kill this velocity before penetrating into the atmosphere, it has a high chance of overheating. It is body ashes and not living astronauts which would be recovered when the command module would plunge into the ocean. This is why it is preferable to make a skip re-entry instead of a direct re-entry in order to sufficiently kill the command module's velocity before penetrating into the atmosphere so that the heating of the command module will remain in acceptable limits. The skip re-entry consists in making the spaceship bounce on the atmosphere instead of directly penetrating into it, and making sufficiently the velocity decrease before effectively penetrating into it for the final descent, so that the remaining velocity will keep the heating due to atmosphere friction in reasonable limits. This is what Russian rockets have done with success. The flight path angle is the angle under which the spaceship penetrates into the atmosphere. It is obvious that the greater it is, and the faster the command module will descend. However, this angle must not go beyond some limit, otherwise the descent speed would be such that it would cause fatal overheating for the command module. NASA has shown the table of re-entry parameters for the various missions. In order to have a better representation of these parameters, this graphic shows the relative variations of the parameters in the various missions. For each graph, the lowest ordinate corresponds to the minimal value of the parameter, and the highest ordinate to the maximal value of the parameter. The horizontal axis corresponds to the missions Apollo 11 on the left, to Apollo 17 on the right. Apollo 13 had a flight path angle smaller than for the missions Apollo 11 and Apollo 12, which had the same one. Consequently, the command module of Apollo 13 fell slower than the ones of Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 have the same maximum acceleration, maximum g, which is normal since they had the same flight path angle. Apollo 13 has a lower maximum acceleration than Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 that had a smaller flight path angle. Consequently, Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 should have an equivalent fall duration and shorter than the one of Apollo 13. But, surprisingly, Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 both have the fall duration greater than the one of Apollo 13, while it should logically be smaller than the one of Apollo 13, as Apollo 13 was falling slower, and Apollo 11 and Apollo 12, which fell the same, have different fall durations. The one of Apollo 12 is close to the one of Apollo 13, a little greater. This is the strange logic of Apollo, don't try to understand. You will be spared the other anomalies of the table of re-entry parameters. Finally, after a long anxious silence, the communication with Apollo 13 was restored, and the command module appeared in sight from the clouds which were hiding it. Its parachutes were opened. It was safe, and so were the astronauts. Now, look how the parachutes of the command module are big compared with it. Now look how smaller were the cases which were containing the parachutes, compared with the size of the command module. So how could the parachutes of the command module be stowed in so small cases? A new miracle? NASA has shown us a demonstration of the command module being dropped from a plane and landing with its parachutes. But in this demonstration the parachutes don't get out of the command module. They are dropped from the plane at the same time as the command module. NASA never showed the demonstration in which the command module was dropped alone, without the parachutes, and the parachutes were later deploying from the command module itself, and for good reason. In fact, the command module did not come back from space. It was dropped from a plane flying at high altitude, at the same time as its parachutes, and splashed down in the ocean like it was returning from space. And the spectators below, who did not see the plane hidden by the clouds, could believe that the command module was returning from its fantastic trip to the moon. Now the NASA video ends with a photo of the lunar module on the so-called moon, and this photo is an obvious final hint of the fakery. Indeed, you can see that the shadow of the lemma extends on the right, which means that the sun is shining from the left, and the camera is not oriented in direction of the sun. The sun can light anything which is material, but it cannot light the void. It can light our atmosphere, for it is something material. But the moon has not atmosphere, and the lunar sky is black. It cannot be illuminated by the sun. So why does the lunar sky appear brilliantly illuminated above the high-gain antenna? And why is there this luminous haze on the right of the photo? People are so fascinated by the moon landings that they can't even realize that this scene is unreal. People often used to think that going to the moon is quite easy. It is at such point that they think that it was easier to really go to the moon than to fake the Apollo missions. They have no idea how much difficult and dangerous going to the moon was. When you believe in something in spite of innumerable incoherences, it means that you believe in it like in a religion.